Thanks, Andrew. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all from whichever part of the world you're in. And for those of you that are to the east of the globe of London that have stayed on this late to hear about privacy and ethics, well, congratulations, because it's never easy, as I was mentioning earlier on, to try and put the sex back into ethics. But I think privacy and ethics is one of the subjects that kind of haunts us all at the moment in this industry. So I hope over the next kind of 15-20 minutes I will just give you a quick update on a number of the more interesting comments, I guess, and theories that are being put forward, rather than just rehash all of the arguments that have been going on for quite some time now, actually, in this particular arena. And this arena is, of course, the digital one. It's not, it is the digital arena that has essentially prompted us to review many of these ethics, many of these ways of working, and that's obviously the basis for the chat today. That technological development, and sorry guys, I'm going to interrupt here because I'm not quite sure I can actually physically get the slides to move on.
Okay, Finn, if you just click right in the middle of the page.
Yep.
And click again. Right in the middle of the page.
Done?
Yeah, you're completely in control now.
Hey. Fantastic. Okay, sorry. As I was saying, I think it's the very fact that the technological developments over the past 5 years have proceeded at such a pace that it has forced us to question some of our values and some of our modus operandi. However, I think in that same sense, in that same way, the privacy landscape now is one very much of shifting sands, and particularly given the amount of things that you can do online in that digital arena, whether it's online through a PC, whether it's through a mobile, through whatever connection you may have. It's a situation where you kind of don't really know where the line is until you've actually crossed it. And for many of us, that poses a significant challenge in terms of conducting the day-to-day business. Up until now, the debates that we have had have tended very much to polarize views. On the one hand, there are people who think that we should simply try and copy and paste our traditional ethics into this new environment, and that we should somehow, if you like, force all of the constraints that have, to be fair, served us well for some time in the past onto this new paradigm. On the other hand, there are people who believe actually we should have no constraints at all. Let it be the Wild West, let the best man win, and if needs be, let's have the shootout at the OK Corral to see who in fact comes out as either the commercial or the methodological winner. Now, while obviously the debate between nothing goes or anything goes is one that certainly is very interesting, and as I said, comes up with some very interesting points of view when you have them, I'm not necessarily sure that it actually serves our industry to any great extent. So, in the middle, there has to be a compromise. The evolution continues to proceed at quite some pace, and I think our thinking must similarly evolve, if you like, and whether that's on a methodological bent or indeed at a philosophical or ethical one, we have to change. And we have to recognize that change, or indeed become very definitely redundant. One of the things I think that separates market research from many other industries is we have always considered it as a profession. The reason we've considered it as a profession is that the more traditional methods of gleaning information were what might be termed as invasive. It was stopping somebody on their daily shopping trip, it was phoning somebody or interrupting them in the middle of watching a soap opera on the TV or whatever. There tended to be some level of invasion, I guess. And because of that, we felt it quite important to have a set of ethics which differentiated us from other industries. And those ethics were designed to engender trust, respect, and ultimately consent. Now, the key here is the fact that it is a professional industry. And those ethics, as I said, have served us very well for a number of years. But in the changing paradigm, can they continue to serve us or not? On the other side, we must also recognize that many of the legislators who are currently entering into the debate around what ethics or what privacy rulings we should have actually know very little about the industry. And certainly if you talk to many of the privacy officers operating in different jurisdictions around the world, a lot of their time is actually now being spent on trying to educate those legislators on what the industry is doing, rather than necessarily having a more rounded debate on what the ethics and what the guidelines of our industry should be. At the end of the day, however, the information that we get comes from respondents or participants or contributors, whatever name we wish to give them. And if we wish to continue collecting that kind of information, they must be assured that whatever information they get is not going to be abused. And I think that's the heart of the argument. We then have to come to some form of mutually acceptable, consensual decision on what abuse then constitutes. And that, I think, is where the debate currently surrounds. The other side of the coin, however, is when you get it wrong, then the respondents start to drift away. A very interesting hypothesis was recently posited at a meeting that we had in Chicago a couple of days ago, where somebody said, look, if we accept that actually response rates around the world by respondents are falling, then we must also recognize that it is the methodologies that we've adopted and the manners in which we have applied them in the past that have helped, as the person said, to suck the life out of every channel of communication we've managed to have with respondents. That's a pretty scary thought. But I think if we don't agree a set of standards by which we operate, then we will continue to suck the life out of the channels that we use to communicate with respondents. And I think that's that's to the detriment of our industry, and if we continue to do so, certainly our industry will die very, very quickly. So, times are changing. We know they're changing. And within that evolutionary process, there are inevitably a number of paradoxes. At the recent panel session that we ran at our online conference in Miami, when we had a great panel, by the way, we had Annie Pettit from Conversation Research Now, we had Manila Austin from Communispace, we had Tom Durack from Insights, we had Reg Baker from Market Strategies, and we also had Adam Phillips, who's the chair of the Professional Standards Committee in SMR. And I think my only regret over that particular debate is that the time that was allotted to them was simply not enough. Now, we might equally argue that there's never enough time to talk about privacy and ethics, particularly in today's market. But here were a number, I guess, of the key themes, some of the key facts that were put on the table by that panel as a prompt, I would suggest, a prompt to get us to thinking about where we should go. And I've kind of listed them as the proverbial paradoxes. So in the same way that, there's an equal and opposite proverb for everyone. He who hesitates is lost, being one, but on the other hand, you should look before you leap. Annie Pettit started off by saying, look, there is a franchise amongst online denizens, online inhabitants, who don't actually want their information dispersed, who don't want their information used. And while many people may be quite happy to publish whatever they're doing online, we must recognize in whatever set of guidelines or ethics or standards that we produce that there's equally a franchise that don't. And SSI recently ran a number of studies as to how this varied across different countries. And it was quite striking that the more developed the internet usage in the country, the more resistant those users of the internet were to have all of their information made publicly available. So it does seem to be a slight paradox in as much as the less developed the usage, in other words, the more innovative, if you like, usage of the internet is, or adoption of the internet is, then the more pro, if you like, the attitudes towards letting everything go online and not regulating it. The more developed, then the less interested perhaps they are in having everything available. And that equally then falls down into kind of the shouters and the whisperers. There are an awful lot of people who use the internet to, not necessarily to self-promote, but who are very happy that that is their primary channel of communication. And others quite happy for those communications to be used in whatever means are appropriate by research or assessment or analytic companies. At the same time, however, there are whisperers. And just an interesting anecdote, one of our last IT managers with us, when he joined the company, he said, oh, listen, one thing you should do is take everything off the internet. Have no bank account, have no nothing, have no Facebook, have no Twitter, because he said if it's on there, trust me, it'll get abused. So again, an interesting dichotomy, I guess, in the two approaches. When it comes down more specifically to research, I think there is again a difference, and this was a point that was quite strongly put forward by Manila Austin of CommuniSpace. On an advocacy platform, really, it is an open forum. There are no real limitations to it. But if we're conducting, whether it's a panel, whether it's a community, whether it's a broad sample, and we're doing work which is dedicated as market research, then I think there was consensus that that should be separated from other work, and that there is a level of consent that is required when asking people to join those sorts of initiatives. Finally, the terms of use versus the legal requirements. I think there has been a lot of debate around the fact that if you adopt or if you utilize a certain piece of software, then the terms of use clearly articulate what can and can't be done with the information that's provided. I think, however, the challenge there is how many of us have ever really read the terms of use? And while ignorance may not necessarily be any excuse, I think as, again, going back to the concept of a profession, if we're going to stand up as a profession and say that we have certain behavioral standards that we would wish to adhere to, in recognizing that people don't always read the terms of use, perhaps we should be a little bit more conscientious and say, look, please note that if you're on this site, we may well use the information that you post for research purposes. Now, that may be a bit of a pipe dream, and it may not be feasible, but if that's the case, let us then agree it worldwide amongst all of those of us that are involved in the industry. The other side of that is that, again, a little bit more on the Wild West side, is to say, no, to hell with it, we're not going to do anything in relation to terms of use. There are legal requirements that already exist, and old-fashioned or all as they may be, let's just let the law dictate what we do. And I think, okay, that is certainly an option. The difficulty there, however, is that legal standards and the legal requirements vary so hugely from country to country and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction that actually consistency is nigh on impossible. And I think there again, as an industry, we have an obligation to say, we as researchers do agree to these set of standards and will apply them consistently across those different markets. Finally, Reg Baker was quite provocative. He said, look, the internet is really only just another modality. It's another means of communicating with people. So on the one hand, there seems to be a certain rationale to say, let's just impose the standards and the rules that we had before. And on the other hand, it says, well, actually, it's a completely new modality. There are no social norms on which we can base any kind of benchmark. So to hell with it, let's just let it ride as it stands and see what comes out in the wash. I think, however, we come back to the very point that I started off with saying, this is an industry on which we have prided ourselves for at least 70 years on gaining consent. And at the heart of things, consent has never, ever failed us. So while that is not an expression of intent or a desire to stop all of the wonderful things that are going on now in the new technological sphere, I think we just simply have to recognize what things have worked and what things possibly have not. In that context, we've recently produced a set of guidelines on using and adapting social media analytics and research. These guidelines were produced in conjunction with CASRO in the US, so that they would be hopefully have as wide an input and indeed a level of acknowledgement from as wide a franchise as possible. So they were constructed by practitioners in the sphere from both sides of the Atlantic. They are by no means set in stone. It is very definitely a kind of a work in progress, a wiki if you like, but one which we would very much ask people to try. As the Americans would say, kick the tires, take it for a test drive, see whether it works. And if it doesn't, then let us know, because the people who constructed those guidelines are ready and waiting to adapt and to amend as comments come in and as challenges come in to see how do we make it or how do we adapt it to this environment and to this industry as it's evolving to make sure that we do get that level of consensual agreement on it. I think the other side of that is if we don't try it and we don't continue the dialogue on what is appropriate and we get it wrong, and let's be honest, there have been some fairly high-profile cases of having gotten it wrong in the past, in the recent past indeed, those errors, those mistakes, cast an extraordinarily long shadow. And regretfully, the shadow doesn't just impact upon the business or the unit that got it wrong. It casts a shadow over the entire industry. And I think that's where it's a question of really, we all have to stand up and be counted. If we're doing work in this arena, then let's describe it, let's understand and discuss what the challenges are, and try and make sure that we can put forward a set of guidelines, standards, ethics, whatever you want to call them, that we can all work to, so that we do provide a level of protection, if you like, or a level of quality where we know we're going to avoid those long shadows as often as we possibly can. There will inevitably be cases where things fall through the net as they have done in the past, but there were holes in the net when we were doing pen and paper surveys and when we were doing telephone surveys. So I think that's simply that's one element of maturation in these new methodologies. But we should be trying to do our utmost to make sure that what we are working to globally, and recognizing that jurisdictions do differ, is as consistent as possible. So, where to from here? I think the panel that got together in Miami were very consistent on the following points. If we are going to be doing work in this new sphere, be transparent. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever for you not to be. And I think, in fairness, oftentimes you can't be. You may try to hide things, but given the nature of the beast, people can very quickly find out what's truly going on. If you are in any doubt at any point in time, get consent. As I said earlier, consent has never failed us. It has been one of the primary posits, one of the primary building stones of market research since observation research started probably 150 years ago, before the questionnaire even came into being in the post-war period. Consent is infallible, or it has been to date. So if in doubt, get consent. We all know the issue around private spaces and the difference between public and private. There are many jurisdictions actually where public data is still only recognized as either the census or the telephone book and nothing else. So I think we certainly have a job of education to do as far as the legislators are concerned. But where we do have password protected areas on the web, don't go in there unless you're invited or unless you have the password. Recent examples, as you well know, of some healthcare work that was conducted in the US impacted very badly, I think, on all of us that have tried to do work in this arena. A plea from me, read the guidelines, test them out. We would dearly love to have your feedback and to understand whether or not you feel they are appropriate, whether they're workable, and indeed whether or not they give you any kind of commercial benefit or advantage when putting forward a proposal to people saying, look, we're going to do this piece of work, it's in these particular elements are we're going to conduct online, be it in social media or other facets, and we're going to adhere to these guidelines. Tell us, please tell us whether or not they bring a benefit to you in your day-to-day activity. And why the plea? Well, ultimately, going back to the fundamental basis, if we lose the trust of our respondents, we simply no longer have a profession. As long as we have trust, we can have engagement, and as long as we have engagement, we get information that serves our needs and allows us to provide our clients with the input that helps them make good business decisions. Now, that engagement, I know, is going to be the theme of some of the speakers who follow me, but for the moment, please read the guidelines. Bear in mind that we are in the business which is dependent on a resource which is not infinite. If we, as I said, I'm going to repeat myself, if we lose the trust of our respondents, we no longer have a profession. So there's a quick recap of the key points in the debate. Thank you again, all of you, for listening in. And Andrew, if there are any questions, I would be only too delighted to take them.